In reading your books, I haven't had time to read your entire bibliography, but I managed to at least take a bite. And I want to, one thing kept jumping out at me. What is the role of cash in the digital economy as you see it? Because it seems to reverberate through your works.
Yeah, well, there was a time when we were told that cash was being phased out and was no longer important. But we know that cash is actually remains important, maybe even increasingly so. I have there's a the 500 euro note is used very often for drug trafficking. They're trying to phase it out. But when I read that, I just realized the euros as well as American dollars are important currency around the world for to avoid the traces that wire transfers can leave. I mean, you can launder money away so that there are no traces for sure, but that takes a lot of accounts, that takes a lot of resources. The average narco figure or other crime figure, they prefer to deal with cash than with wire transfers. So cash, as far as I can tell, is still pretty important. Are you finding it otherwise?
I was about to ask you about the type of cash used because, while it seems US dollars are certainly still in demand, there seems to be, particularly as other currencies like the euro, for example, become unstable, or now most recently the British pound,
Right.
it seems like there is a flight to, people are wondering what is, in an era where central banks freely manipulate rates of exchange and, in fact, fiscal policy as a whole, what's a safe currency to use?
You know, I assume it's the American dollar. That's what I've been told. My sources tell me that the euro is still considered to be desirable, but it's taken something of a hit since Brexit. So, you know, I just know what my sources in the criminal underworld tell me.
Sources in the criminal underworld?
And what I'm told is that the US dollar remains the sort of lingua franca.
All right. Well, since you mentioned sources in the criminal underworld, I'd like to sound you out a little bit more about them because another thing I noticed that reverberates in your work is the use of shell companies. Now, shell companies, as we know, are very handy vehicles when it comes to hiding and transferring money and basically keeping it one step ahead of the authorities who would otherwise want to take it away from you, or at least tax it. So shell companies seem to have increased their importance in today's economies, both on the licit and illicit sides. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Well, I know more about the illicit sides than on the licit sides. You may know more about the licit sides. But it's easy, really easy to form a shell company. I've been tempted to do it just to sort of show that I can do it. I haven't done it yet, but I know how to. I know which bank I'd go to and where and all that. And I mean, there are shell companies that are formed for completely legitimate purposes, but it is desirable when you're dealing with kind of questionable transfers of money to make sure that you've got a company within a company within a company as distanced as possible. It's analogous to the way you launder cash, which is to sort of move it from point to point to point until it disappears. So shell companies are sort of part of what you can call the criminal underworld, and they are easy to form. And we saw from the Panama Papers that a lot of people have shell companies, including people who insist they're doing legitimate business. What are you finding?
I'm finding that the authorities tasked with stopping these black capital flows seem to always be playing catch up, and often they are hindered. No, hindered isn't even the right word. They really seem to be 3 or 4 steps behind the bad guys who seem to be ever more innovative when it comes to moving, hiding, or even transforming illicit capital flows. It seems like the side of law and order is really just coming off the bench, and it's already on the third string, whereas the other side is running its A team on its A game, and they are miles ahead.
So what is transferring revenue? What does that mean?
Transferring revenue in a way from either point or sanctuary A to sanctuary B, or form A to form B. Give you an example. The Treasury right now is trying to instill all these new anti-inversion policies in place to counter what they call income stripping. Income stripping is simply a way of a domestic company transferring assets from its domestic highly tax base, i.e. in the United States, to its adjunct arm in a country with a lower tax base, i.e. Ireland. And if the way they do that is simply they load up that foreign company with debt. So if you are a U.S. and Irish-based company, you load up the Irish one with debt, and then you make the interest payments on the debt, and that way it's perfectly legal on the books. But what you're actually doing is transferring your income from country A, sanctuary A, to country B, sanctuary B, where B is obviously more favorable to you. That's what the government is now trying to step in and counter.
So Adam, that's the inversion?
That's the anti-inversion policies which are now being proposed and are up for congressional review.
Yeah.
That's the counter income stripping. Now, that's the licit side of the street. Now, the illicit side of the street is going to be something like, well, let's say you have a great big pile of money from, shall we say, ill-gotten gains. Now, you need to move that from one side of the world to the other. Let's say you are in, let's say a Middle Eastern country that begins with I, and you want to move that over to a nice, safe bank out of authorities' reach, let's say a small island city-state that starts with S. So you want to do this in a way that attracts minimal or no attention. You want to do this in the fastest way possible, and you want to do it in a way that's hopefully prevents you from getting ripped off. So you got to figure out the right way to do that. Shell companies and wire transfers are obviously one way of effecting this transfer, at least as far as what my sources tell me. What do yours tell you?
Yeah, well, I hear roughly the same thing. I mean, I'm not an expert in this. I sort of, when it comes to complicated technical arrangements, financial arrangements, I have sources actually a lot more in law enforcement, in FBI and former FBI and DOJ and places like that, or basically people who used to be with the government who are now involved in trying to solve the money laundering problem. So.
Okay. Now, in trying to solve the money laundering problem, okay, we've covered the methods and we've covered home team versus the away team. Right. Now, I wanted to ask you about the role of identity, because that goes through now beyond your books and into the sort of the conundrum of modern life. It is easy for a company to disappear. It is, in fact, favorable often for a company to disappear, certainly if a company is doing wrong, shall we say. Okay. Now, you have it in the characters that you write about are doing the same thing as individuals. Individuals, identity itself seems to be disappearing. Is that a function of modern life where we have these sort of layers of what identifies us being arbitrarily assigned government numbers or bank accounts or IP addresses? Or is it simply something else? Is it a way for us to escape ourselves?
I think there was a time, maybe 20 years ago and more, when it was really easy to go off the grid, and you'd find all these great books from Loon Panics that told you how to go off the grid. I think it's harder and harder because so much of our identity is sort of is captured on the internet in a million different ways. So my sense is that it's more difficult to disappear. Still not impossible. It's still possible to go off the grid. But then you've got to deal with cash. You know, you basically have to, if you've got to somehow bring cash with you, get cash. And that's apparently the big hang-up.
Now, since you are obviously a prolific writer, how do you decide which tense to write in? Because you seem to bounce back and forth freely between the first and the third.
Uh, I I use first person for my Nick Heller books, my series. Uh, I like first person a lot. There is an immediacy to it. Readers, I think, bond very quickly with a first person narrator, but there are limitations. If you want to show what the bad guys are doing while we're in the head of our hero, we have no way of showing it. So first person really limits what you can show. It's got to be all told from the POV of our hero. So I have cheated in a couple of books by having Nick's story in the first person, and then I'll have another story, another person's story in the third person, and I sort of alternate the chapters that way. In general, for my standalones, I prefer what I call a close third person. That is third person narration, but with a lot of narrative give to it so that it feels like we're in that person's head.
All right, let's talk about categorization, which is something every novelist certainly seems to have to deal with in terms of not only their publishers, but their booksellers and their public. It's been said that the difference between mystery and thriller is that in a mystery, the reader actually has to find out who done it, whereas in a thriller, the bad guys are there from the beginning, and the reader can go along with them through the story.
Yeah.
Where do you stand on that?
Well, that's about right. I sort of see that my sense is that a mystery is a whodunit, and a thriller is a howdunit. It really is about the process more than discovering who the bad guy is. There are mystery elements within thrillers, of course. You can have a thriller without a mystery as well. So I write what in the US market we call thrillers, which in the UK market they call crime fiction. And I don't know, beyond that, I don't worry. I sort of figure that my publisher's got to know how to market it. I forget if they call it fiction or thriller fiction. I don't know what they call it in the Library of Congress designation, but I don't really have to worry about that too much. I sort of let them do their job, my publisher.
When you go on tour, where do you find you get the best reader feedback? Domestic, foreign, something close to home, or something further abroad?
Interesting. Some of the best reader feedback I've ever gotten was on tour in Israel, where I have a lot of loyal fans, and people had read and reread some of my books, so they knew them better than I did. Okay. But when I go on tour, I almost always go into a mystery bookstore or an independent, a store that has a kind of built-in community. And almost always the readers there have read my previous books. People will show up with boxes or shopping bags full of old titles for me to sign. And people like that who have read all of my books tend to be very passionate about what they read, and they are very verbal about it. And they will tell me what they don't like and what they do like. I get a lot of emails from people who I've met on the road. And the truth is, Adam, you're in your own head when you're writing the book. And you're imagining an audience. You don't know the reader. You're sort of imagining a reader. But when you actually go into a bookstore, you meet someone who's read the book, they have created the movie in their own heads, They have their own bonding, their own experience of the book, which may be different from what you intended. So it's a kind of like market testing,
One final question for you. Your work has obviously spanned the rise of the internet in the role of publishing and of book selling.
Right.
What kind of impact has that had on your work?
Not really a lot.
Lucky you.
I tell a story. I don't care how how it's transmitted. You know, if it's in paperback, if it's in mass market or trade paperback, I don't really care. If it's hardcover, if it's audio, if it's ebook form, they're all. I mean, I find that something like I have a ratio of 2 to 1, 3 to 1 often ebook. I have a much higher ebook readership than I do print book, and I prefer to read print myself. So the internet has had a couple of effects, and one of them is given us a whole technology to play with in making thrillers. You know, email and the conversation that you and I are having, for example. I mean, how cool is that? We take it for granted now, but 10 years ago we didn't. So technology is changing really quickly. My books are snapshots of the way the world was the year the book was published. So if you read Paranoia, for example, a lot of the technology is outdated. The basic story works, but the technology is old. So when they did the movie, they had to sort of change and update the technology. I don't really care about that. I mean, I sort of deal with how things are now and focus on telling the best story I can.
And we are the better for it. And we have been speaking with Mr. Joseph Finder, author of the Nick Heller series, Paranoia, The Fixer, and the list goes on. Thank you again for being with us, and thanks for being on the program.
It's great to talk to you, Adam.